Hey everyone. Okay, so let's talk about the right to safety. Safety does not have its own article in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but like health, it's infused throughout the human rights canon. It is an implied human right. The right to life, the right not to be tortured, the right to seek asylum, the right to a standard of living that's adequate to ensure well-being, the right to safety at work, the right to medical care. All of those invoke safety. And the human right to safety is implied in most human rights canon documents. So the ICCPR, the ICESCR, yeah, I'm using too many abbreviations here, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Safety is also implied in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which we haven't talked about yet. The Convention for Migrants, the Convention for People with Disabilities, the Convention on Prevention of Discrimination by Race and Gender. All of those things invoke safety implicitly. Now, there are a variety of potential ways we could define safety, actually. We could talk about physical security. Are you physically safe? We could talk about mental well-being. We could talk about consumer protection. But usually when we talk safety, we're talking about protection from violence and danger specifically. In the United States, that typically means guns. Public safety is often spearheaded by non-governmental organization, that's NGO, advocacy groups. But human rights framing requires that we look at the obligations of the state, and it really doesn't focus on what individuals are obligated to do to protect themselves. That's not what human rights are about. Human rights are about the relationship among people and between individuals and the state. So there are basically four state obligations, as I see it, to protect people's safety. And I want to go through these one at a time briefly. First of all, there's the obligation of the state to monitor and regulate sources of danger. Second, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Second, there's the state's obligation to monitor and regulate resources, the absence of which could be deadly, so resources that people need to survive. The state has an obligation to recognize and prevent emergencies from arising in the first place. And once they do arise, the state has an obligation to defeat danger on behalf of its citizens or on behalf of the humans living within that state. So let's take each of those a piece at a time here. Monitoring and regulating hazards. This includes things like for food and drugs, inspecting to ensure quality and safety. For housing, making sure that people's homes have no asbestos or lead, establishing earthquake codes so that your house doesn't fall down when there's an earthquake. In terms of environment, things like protecting people against toxins or pollution or radiation or air quality. In terms of something like transportation, doing car and plane inspections, doing auto emissions, road and bridge maintenance. And in the case of guns, ensuring security, training, licensing, and registration. All of those things go to the basic obligation to monitor and regulate hazards so that they don't become a problem. In terms of monitoring, regulating resources we need to survive, that's things like you have to have food and water available. It has to be clean, potable water that people can drink. There has to be an adequate food stock. In terms of electrical grid and heating, there has to be a reliable grid. Things like LIHEAP, low-income heating assistance program. And in terms of medicine and vaccines, there has to be an adequate supply of vaccines. There has to be an adequate supply of things like insulin. That is an obligation of the government to ensure people's safety. Recognizing and preventing emergencies from arising. This would include things like crime prevention and counterterrorism so that we stop crime before it starts. It would also include things like identifying people who are at risk for harm, so setting up suicide or domestic violence hotlines, or red flag laws, which we're going to talk about in the next clip. Extreme weather and disaster forecasting is part of this obligation of the state. Things like finding ways to predict tornadoes, hurricanes, fires, even whether the local volcano was going to go off. And diplomacy, lowering tensions among nations by developing good diplomatic relations with other countries. Things like the relationship between India and Pakistan, which are perennially just about on the edge of attacking each other, and both of them have nukes. All of those would fall under the heading of recognizing and preventing emergencies from arising. But sometimes worst comes to worst, as in the current situation we're in right now. Sometimes a danger does arise, an emergency happens, and the state has to be prepared to deal with it by doing things like supporting first responders, firefighters, emergency medical services, the National Guard, setting up amber alerts or silver alerts so that if a child gets kidnapped or an older adult dealing with dementia goes missing, people are in a position to do something about it. This is also the obligation under which we deal with natural disasters by doing things as complicated as putting together a disaster relief infrastructure and FEMA, but also things as simple as just making sure that there are fire hydrants all over the place and that they're clear from snow. Dangers at home include protecting us from each other through peacekeeping or police forces, and dangers abroad include protecting us from foreign threats, through the military in particular. Now, a lot of this could be framed in terms of dealing with a pandemic, but let's give the coronavirus a rest for a moment. I want you to go and watch a video, and then in the next clip, I want to talk about guns.